One of the fundamental principles of liberalism is the difference between individual and the collective. The problem is not to choose who is going to rule us, but how to restrain that ruler when he begins to rule us. And so, really, the fundamental principle of liberalism contrasts the individual versus the collective. And here we have seen in India this principle before independence and after independence. In 1947, we got our political independence. Unfortunately, we also lost our economic freedom, which is where the principle behind that was the notion of socialism. Our leaders in the 1950s were under the spell of socialism, and as was a lot of the world. And so, in the interest of the social good, we actually lost a lot of the individual liberty at the time. So, in fact, we lost it for 40 years, and we began to get our economic liberty only after 1991. The period between 1950 and 1990, the 4 lost decades of our history, was really an aberration, because before that, oddly enough, even during the time of the British, when we did not have political liberty, we had far more economic liberty in our nation. And the reality is that that 50 to 90 period was a kind of aberration in our history. From the beginning, when markets first began, which is at the time, it goes really back to the time in human history when there is an agricultural surplus. Before about 10,000 years ago, humans were hunters and gatherers. And all our time was spent in subsistence, making a living. However, with the coming of agriculture, for the first time, there was a surplus of food. And when there was a surplus, somebody had more wheat, somebody had more corn, and they didn't want to waste it, so they exchanged it through barter. And as this barter system began, somebody had clothing, somebody lacked clothing, and so these trading posts came about. And trading posts where people bartered then went on to become wholesale and retail markets, and then they became the heart of the city. So cities were born through markets. Markets came first. Markets, as Hayek says, are a spontaneous order. Spontaneous in the sense that morality, nobody invented morality in every society, but it came up. The internet is an example today of spontaneous order. So markets begin as spontaneous order, they lead to cities. The origin and cities and citizens. The origin of the word city is really from the Roman word civitas, and the same word goes on to mean civilization. So markets lead to cities, lead to citizens, lead to civic sense, lead to civilization. Anyway, coming to the situation of our aberration in our history, which was what you can give it the name Nehruvian socialism, you can call it the license permit inspector Raj that the Swatantra leaders and Rajaji is particularly, Rajagopalachari called it. But this was the period when really we made a number of mistakes. One of the mistakes was to close our economy to imports. And this created that period where we thought import substitution was the right way to go. Import substitution the name resulted in being a high cost economy, and that economy could not export. And therefore, we really never realized the potential of an enormous explosion in trade that took place after the Second World War and which lasted for 25 years. And I remember at that time I was a manager with a company which made Vicks Vapor Rub. And in that company, I was 1 year, we had been given a license. For everything you needed a license. The license also specified the capacity of that means how much you could produce, how much capacity you were licensed to produce. And there was in the early 1980s, there was a flu, and we ended up selling a lot of Vicks Vapor Rub, which went beyond our licensed capacity. We were making the product in 3 shifts. And the company, I was the head of the company, and the company secretary came to tell me that he had taken an opinion from the lawyers and that we had broken the law, and that meant that I could go to jail. And I got really scared. But then I said, how can a democratic country send somebody to jail for producing too much? And that thought allowed me to sleep at night. But the company secretary would remind me every few months at that time that I could go to jail. This was the loss of liberty that this entailed. But there were many other examples. I was suddenly called to Delhi to see the undersecretary. And the undersecretary, first of all, he gave me an appointment for 11 o'clock in the morning, which meant I had to take an early morning flight from Bombay. At that time, there were only 3 flights a day between Delhi and Bombay by Indian Airways. And because the demand was so great and the capacity was limited, I was 172 on the waiting list. And somehow my travel agent had to do whatever he could to get me on that flight so I could meet the undersecretary. So I arrived on time. The undersecretary was gone. I waited. Then I was told he's gone to lunch now. And I waited. And then in the afternoon, he came and he saw me and he said, "Well, what did I call you for?" I said, "Sir, you called me and I have gone through a hell of a lot to just come for this appointment, and you don't know why you've called me?" And his arrogant answer was, "You multinationals, you make enough profit. You can hang around in my office." All he was showing to me was the superiority of the government at the time. And I knew that the government then had no clue about business, but they could put me out of business. And that was really the story when the tax rate of the country was 97%. Plus, there was a wealth tax, which took us to 99%. So, who in his mind, sense, could work in such a situation? And when Jawaharlal Nehru proclaimed publicly that profit is a dirty word, the J.R.D. Tata asked him, J.R.D. said that, look, he knew Mr. Nehru very well, so they were friends, and he said, I think the public sector should be expected to make a profit. Because profit, and Nehru said, don't talk to me about profit, profit's a dirty word. And Tata said, sir, profit is a function of efficiency. If you don't make a profit, then you are likely to be inefficient. And so, anyway, that was the atmosphere in which we operated when government servants could keep us waiting outside their doors. There's another story, a friend of mine who was an entrepreneur. He wanted a loan from a public sector bank. And he waited a whole day outside the office of the bank manager, who in the end refused it, because my friend was not politically connected. The first priority of public sector banks was to give loans to members of the Congress party. By closing our economy during the license Raj, what our policymakers did not realize is a fundamental idea in economics, which is called the theorem of convergence. Convergence says that if a rich country and a poor country are connected through trade or investment, then the standard of living of the two will become equal. Now, how does that happen? It happens because standard of living depends on productivity of the country. Productivity depends on technology. And when they are connected, the poor country just takes the technology of the rich country and it starts producing. For example, the cell phone, the computer, all these, we did not invent them, but yet we use them vigorously, and we have become enormously productive as a result of the use of these, and obviously also wealthier as a result of this. And you may ask, why is it that this did not happen earlier when the rich and the poor country were connected? Well, the reality is that most of the world was, if you take it as late as even 1975, most of the world was not connected. They were following the bad ideas that India was following. But after that, there was a study done in which there was a study of 87 countries, and of these 87 countries, and I'm talking about especially countries of third world countries, only 7 were connected. And the 7 that were connected grew for 20 years 6 times faster than the rest who were not connected. And so obviously, you can guess which those 6-7 countries were. They were the Asian tigers. And those countries, and of course afterwards, we have seen when India joined up in 91, when China joined up with the world from 1978 onwards, we have seen a huge growth in wealth. and the elimination of poverty. Between India and China, more than 750 million people have risen out of poverty. And China, which is really the star example, is today challenging the United States, challenging the United States economically. And that explains today's trade war between China and the United States. And it's not clear that the United States is going to win. So the notion of import substitution was always a bad idea. It goes back in the 1950s to a second-rate Latin American economist, Raul Prebisch, who talked about the fact that the poor countries were condemned to poverty, and therefore they should not trade, because he felt that they would never be able to get a comparative advantage against the rich. And India embraced the ideas of this second-rate economist, and we suffered for 40 years. In fact, the record is pretty clear. If you look at India's economic history for the last 100 years or so, between 1900 and 1950, India's economy grew at 1%. And our population also grew at 1%. So the net gain per capita was 1 minus 1, which is equal to 0. From 1950, the economy did begin to grow. It grew, instead of 1%, it went up to 3.5% between 1950 and 1980. But the population went up to 2.2 from 1. So 3.5 minus 2.2, you can see is 1.3, which we moaned and groaned and called it the Hindu rate of growth. Of course, it had nothing to do with being Hindu. It was a rate of growth of the socialist license permit inspector Raj. Then finally, from 1980s, we had some liberalization under Rajiv Gandhi, and a full-blown liberalization after 1991, when the reforms really took off. And if you see the record from then onwards, that 3.5% rate of growth goes to 5.5, 5.5 goes to 8 over the next 2-3 decades. And this is a testimony to the market economy, the difference. Meanwhile, the population rate also slows down. So in the decade between 2002 and 2011, what you have is a rate of growth of 8 minus the population has come down to 1.4. So then that's what you have is a tigerish rate of growth. Now, if we can grow at that rate for a few decades, we would have really essentially become a middle class country. As we know, 1991 was a watershed in our country's history. That is when we began to get economic liberty. In 1947, we had only got our political liberty. Now, the reforms certainly had a great impact, but the reforms were incomplete. And if you have lived in Delhi as I have, it's been a frustrating experience because the reforms have been so slow. However, even these slow reforms have added up, and they've added up to make India one of the fastest growing major countries in the world. The question that many people ask is that 64 countries did the same reforms that India did. But why did India become the fastest growing democracy in the world? And the reason, I believe, is a politically incorrect reason, which very few people will concede. There, we are used to demonizing our caste system. And of course, most of us believe that the caste system was morally wrong. Hierarchical societies, especially if they are sanctioned by religion and by society, are bad. But one of the features of our caste system was to have a merchant caste. And these merchant communities across the country have been very vibrant at periods of history, long history of trade, and they have what it takes. They've learned, it's in their DNA, how to conserve capital, how to grow capital, and how to make a society wealthy. So if you do reforms in a society where you already have people who know how to grow capital, you have a head start. It's like doing reforms in Israel, where the Jews have got it in their DNA. And so I believe that this is certainly one of the reasons. And it came home to me because a few years ago, I looked in the list of the Fortune, Forbes has a list of the top billionaires in the world. India has over 100 people on that list. It had 120 on that list that year. And you know that 3/4 of the people on that list had what we would call Banya names or Vaishya antecedents, that they belonged to those merchant communities. And so while we've had an explosion of Dalit entrepreneurship, of software entrepreneurship, which does not relate in any way to the old business houses, nevertheless, the benefits that India has had are from the merchant communities have been very significant. Yet, despite the reforms, the reality is that the average person in India still believes that the market makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. This is despite the evidence of the last 25 years when we have lifted, almost 400 million people above the poverty line. The Indian middle class has grown from 10% to 35%. Because of this, yet people believe this. And the reason for believing this is, of course, that no one has sold the reforms to the people. And I blame the reformers. The chief blame goes to Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was our chief reformer, but also to many others in the country who have been reformers. Margaret Thatcher used to say that I spend 20% of my time doing the reforms and 80% of the time selling reforms. And therefore, Indians do not today distinguish between being pro-market and pro-business. They think reforms really help the business people. They don't realize that reforms or the market means creating competition, that competition helps to improve the quality of products. Competition helps lower costs as firms compete, that it lowers the prices of products and brings and the fruits of technology we can see all around us. That, when 1 billion people have cell phones in the country, that's an enormous tribute to the free market. So I do believe that our politicians are still essentially afraid of talking about reform or selling reform, and therefore reforms happen at, with stealth, at night, when no one's looking. That's the whole way of doing reforms. Because nobody thinks he can win an election by giving the message of the market. And they may well be right. In a democracy, one of the problems is that if one candidate says, I'll give you free electricity and I'll give you free or rice at 2 rupees, that candidate, and the other candidate is a liberal candidate who says that yes, I'll encourage investment, I'll make sure that user charges are paid, and says all the right things from the perspective of a responsible leader, he will lose. The leader who gives free electricity always wins. And this is one of the dilemmas, I'm afraid, that I have just not been able to come to grips with. And there's no end to the free. I mean, here was a young, intelligent leader of the AAP party, who we thought was a different party that came to power in Delhi, the Aam Aadmi party. And what has the leader of that party been doing? He's been offering free this and subsidized this and everything, and the exchequer, and destroying the exchequer of Delhi in the meantime. I have edited for Penguin this box set, which is 10 volumes plus 14 volumes in a series of economic and business history called The Story of Indian Business. And from this particular from these tales of trade, I have learnt a number of things. One of the things I have learnt is that India had a flourishing trading culture in the past. In fact, we had a positive balance of trade right through history until the Industrial Revolution. And the merchant in India had a high place. He was one of the upper castes. The merchant, although he was number 3, but he was a Dvija. He was a twice born. And in certain places like Gujarat, he was a respected figure. And when people went away on a pilgrimage, they would leave the keys to their house with the merchant because they trusted the merchant. With a 6,000 kilometer coastline, India had a flourishing trade which was managed by the merchants. And at the time during the Roman Empire, there was one ship from Rome that arrived on an Indian port every day. One of the most famous ports was the port of Muziris. Muziris is in Kerala, close, about 15 kilometers away from today's Kochi or Cochin or Ernakulam. And if you and visiting that port was a Roman writer and senator named Pliny. Pliny went back to Rome and he discovered that Rome, because of the trade with India, Rome was losing 2/3 of its bullion, of its gold and silver to India. And he was very disturbed. So he got up in the Roman Senate in 78 AD, and he said to the Roman senators, stop wearing those togas. They're made of Indian cotton. He told the senators, tell your wives to stop cooking with Indian spices. And he said, and wearing Indian luxuries of jewelry and silk and so on. And he said that unless we sell more, unless our traders sell more to Indians, we will go bankrupt. This is just one of the many stories. When Vasco da Gama came here, financed by the King of Spain, he too found great wonders, great riches, and he brought back ships, a shipload of Indian goods. But in the process, the Indians did not want anything that was made, that he had brought. And so he was very apologetic to the King of Spain that he had given away all the silver that the Spain and Portugal were bringing from the New World at that particular time. The point here I wanted to make is that this process continued right through till the Industrial Revolution and the East India Company. In fact, the East India Company had the same experience. East India Company discovered again the soft cottons from the muslin of Dhaka and so on, and it also changed the clothing habits of the West, because when the rich and the aristocracy discovered this fine cotton, they began to wear underwear for the first time. And second, in the 19th and later, that was 18th century, in the 19th century, the middle classes started wearing underwear. In the 20th century, everybody started wearing underwear. And so the habit of wearing underwear in the world began with the discovery of Indian cotton. So, what changed the situation was the Industrial Revolution, where India, which represented 25% of world share of trade at the time, and many estimates place the GDP to be roughly the same before the Industrial Revolution, say around 1750. The terms of trade, because Indians found that it was cheaper to buy the mill-made cottons from abroad than the cottons made by the handlooms in their country. The handloom weavers' jobs were lost, and so our whole belief that Britain impoverished us came into being. The problem, I think, is that's too simplistic. The reality is it was technological obsolescence that led to the loss of jobs. All over the world, cotton textiles, handloom textiles were replaced by mill-made textiles. India, because it had the largest share of the cotton in the world, suffered the most. What is unfortunate is that when we got independence, we thought that it was trade that had impoverished us. And so, during that period of Nehruvian socialism, we closed our doors to trade. And this was unfortunate, because between the wars, India's mill-made cloth had become competitive to the world, and 1/4 of market share in the world was Indian. It was in entrepreneurs like Kasturbai Lalbhai who represented the formidable nature of Indian textiles. Unfortunately, Indian textile industry died as a result of the license Raj. However, the idea that the East India Company, what we call the East India Company syndrome, was responsible for our poverty, the trade, was a very, very unfortunate thing. And even now, it is unfortunate that we still have not got over that idea. In the last few years under Modi, Mr. Modi's leadership, we have again become protectionists. There have been 7 rounds of rising of tariffs, which we had so hard fought to bring down. And India has not, as of just now, as a few weeks ago, India refused to join RCEP, which was a trade union of 16 Asian countries, because we were afraid that we were not competitive. So the fact is that trade is a great engine for prosperity. No country in the world went from poverty to prosperity without international trade. Exports has been the engine driver of prosperity and the Industrial Revolution around the world. And we are not going to be any different. It's very sad that we closed our economy at the very time that Japan in the 50s, Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Asian tigers came up in the 60s and 70s. And they enjoyed enormous prosperity. And they became first world countries. And we remained a third world country because we closed the door to free trade. So there's a central tenet of liberalism is the idea of free trade.